Welcome, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. We're just going to let folks filter into the webinar. So just get settled in and we'll start in just a minute or two. Welcome everyone. We're just getting started here, letting folks filter into their spots for this webinar. So just hang tight for a minute or two and we'll get started. Welcome, folks. As folks settle in, we're about to get started here. Thanks so much for being here. We're just going to let folks settle in for a minute. So appreciate you all joining. We'll start very shortly. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. What do you think, Karen? Should we start? Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jordan Treacle. I'm the Policy and Programs Director at the National Family Farm Coalition, and I'm going to help facilitate today's conversation. Really appreciate our speakers being here and all of you all and participating in this conversation. I'm going to do a little bit of more introduction in a second. We want to make sure that everybody is set up with the interpretation function that we have today. So many of you have been on webinars in the past with interpretation, but if not, you can see the image that is there. You can also go down to the More button on the bottom right of your screen, click on that. If you go to the globe, you should be able to find English or Spanish, which are the two languages that we're using today. If you have any problems with the interpretation, feel free to drop a note in the chat for us. But really appreciate IATP and our interpreter today for supporting language justice in this conversation. Um, Today's conversation is going to be is a joint webinar between the National Family Farm Coalition and the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy, and we're going to hear a bit more from IATP in just a second. But this is meant to be a presentation from a number of allied voices on the ground, and we're also going to have some time at the end of this of the panel presentation to get some questions from the floor. And so if you don't mind using the chat function to put your questions as they come up, we're going to do our best to track those questions throughout the conversation and then direct them to the speakers at the end of our time today. So please do use the chat function for that. This webinar is going to be recorded and will be sent to everyone who registered for today's webinar. So that recording is already going and was a request from a number of different folks who could not make it live today. And then lastly here, just a reminder that we do have interpretation. You can find that by hitting the More and then the Globe button on the bottom right of your screen. So with that tech overview, I'm just really happy again to have you all here for this conversation about trade policy in North America. As mentioned, this is a joint effort between the National Family Farm Coalition and the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy. Our aim here is to provide some insight into the official, if opaque, review process of the US Mexico Canada Trade Framework, or USMCA. But more importantly, is also to hear from farmers and advocates in all three countries, from Canada to Mexico, on some of the key components of a justice-oriented trade agreement for North America, and how the current absence of a trade justice framework in our region is impacting rural communities. So we're going to hear from four speakers today. We have three panelists from allied organizations in Canada, Mexico, and the US, who I will introduce later. But first, to kick us off, I'm going to turn the word over to Karen Hansen-Kuhn, who's the co-organizer of this event, to introduce herself and help situate this conversation in the broader trade policy moment and landscape, particularly as it relates to USMCA. Over to you, Karen.
Hello. It's great to be here today and to see all of you. I want to talk about some of the innovations, some of the changes in USMCA. Some of these people may remember there were a couple of good innovations. There's a rapid response mechanism on labor rights that gets to factory level labor rights violations. They eliminated many forms of investor-state dispute settlement. That's a tool that allows foreign investors to sue governments over public interest laws that affect their potential profits. And there were plenty of bad innovations as well. For the first time, there is an annex on agricultural biotechnology that streamlines the approval process. And of course, there are a lot of other issues. But one of the other innovations was a sunset clause in the agreement that provides for the review of the agreement that we're going through right now. So I want to talk a little bit about the timeline of what's happened with that review, at least in the United States. I don't know if our Canadian and Mexican friends can tell us more about how it's playing out there. So far, USTR asked for written comments in the fall. Thousands of individuals and organizations submitted their comments for how the agreement should be changed. IATP and NFFC and the Western Organization of Resource Councils submitted written comments as well on the three issues we'll be talking about today. We also testified at a public hearing in December, and since then, USTR made a report to Congress about, in a general way, about some of the issues that they think need to be addressed. It's still not entirely clear what the role of Congress is in this process, but they are at least being consulted. So the next step, on June 1st, the three governments should notify each other of any things they are going to want to change. And July 1st, which is the sixth anniversary of the USMCA, they will make a decision about what to do next. They could decide to continue negotiations on the issues they flag in June. And if they do so, we think that could continue into the fall. They could decide to get out of the agreement. And if they can't agree, at this point, it would set off a process of yearly reviews for the next 10 years. If they can agree before that, the agreement continues. If they can't, then they start dismantling the agreement. So that's the point we're in now. A lot of organizations have made their positions clear about what they think needs to happen. And I think for us, some of this, of course, the three issues we're flagging here, these are not the only things that need to be changed in this agreement, but it does provide a real platform for us to talk about what needs to change, to engage with partners in other countries, and to highlight solutions for the medium term. And for our organizations, it was really important that we talk not only about, well, about issues that would not only help American farmers, but also farmers in all three countries. Our partners, our trading partners are that. They are allies. They're not our adversaries. And we think at this moment in time, it's important to remember that. So we have three experts here who will go into a lot more depth on the issues, but I just want to flag the three sets of issues we've addressed. The first is around transparency. And here we think the three countries should just agree to disagree. The US had mandatory country of origin labeling for meat for several years, and it was dismantled because of a WTO dispute, where it was found to be overly burdensome to track where the animals were coming from and identify them. This has continued to be a priority for US farm groups to try and restore that labeling program, both so consumers know where their food is coming from, and as a tool to disrupt extreme corporate concentration in that sector. It's not the only solution for that problem, but it is a problem. And our proposal is to have a peace clause where the three countries agree not to sue each other over this issue, either in the USMCA or at the WTO, and to work towards a permanent solution. There's a precedent for that kind of mechanism. For more than 10 years now, there has been a peace clause related to India's rice stocks program. So it is possible we can agree to disagree and work toward a solution. Next issue is around food sovereignty, or more specifically, seed sovereignty. And we think this is an example of one of the, I would say, perhaps many unnecessary rules in the agreement that should just be taken out. USMCA requires countries to sign a treaty that prohibits farmers from saving and sharing seeds. This is a real obstacle to agroecological transitions. In addition, the US has negotiated 9 agreements on reciprocal trade. These are new agreements that the US is pushing on other countries. Some of them countries we already have trade agreements with, like Guatemala, others like Argentina and Malaysia, where we don't. But making progress on this issue in the USMCA could help us to raise these issues internationally in those other agreements as well. So I'm sure we can think of other things that should be removed from USMCA, but this is certainly one of them. And then finally, reducing overproduction and enhancing resilience. And here our solution is that we learn from each other. Canada has a dairy supply management program that balances supply and demand at prices that are fair to farmers and consumers. It is sheltered by tariffs and other trade restrictions that allow it to function, and it has been the subject of a lot of pressure from the US. We would join many US farm organizations like NFFC, Wisconsin Farmers Union, as well as unions like the United Food and Commercial Workers, who say that we should stop these challenges and instead we should convene a trinational participatory commission to learn from the Canadian experience and see how we might do something similar in other countries. So generally, I think when we think about trade agreements right now, I think, maybe this is wishful thinking, but I think the old model is kind of dead. I don't think we're going to be seeing any new USMCAs or Trans-Pacific partnerships or anything. We'll be seeing something different. And this means it's an important time for us to be defining what the shape of new agreements or deals, arrangements might be for the future, for the medium term. And again, I think this USMCA process provides us a platform to try to do so. So I'm going to leave it at that. Like I said, we have some really great speakers here who can talk to you about these issues in depth.
Thank you so much, Karen, for setting up the conversation and positioning this conversation in what is obviously a very tumultuous time in trade policy, not just in North America, globally, but particularly in North America. Um, so we're going to get into our panel now. And just a reminder to folks, participants, that you can drop questions into the chat that we will try to cover towards the end of our webinar. But I'd like to go ahead and introduce our first panelist. Phil Mount is Vice President for Policy at the National Farmers Union of Canada. Born and raised on a dairy farm in Eastern Ontario, Phil is the Vice President for Policy at NFU. Phil has a research background in political economy and sustainable regional food systems, and along with Denise, is currently developing joint food and farm enterprises, expanding both a mixed Katahan flock at Flat Earth Farm and a processing and food service enterprise at the Sheepdog Grill. I hope I got the name of that flock correct, Phil. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but Phil, you've got 10 minutes. I'll raise my hand when I have about a minute left. Please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, not too badly. The Katahdin is breed from Maine. There you go. Learn something new every day. I'm here to tie this conversation about trade justice to the one agricultural program that I know of that has ensured food sovereignty for farmers for almost my entire lifetime. And thanks, Karen, for that great introduction and segue. Supply management in Canada is indeed a food sovereignty program. And Canada is the only country that retains this balanced approach to agricultural markets. All other countries have given in to market extremism. In Canada, we apply supply management to dairy, eggs, chickens, and turkeys. The basics of the supply management system are pretty simple. First, farmers agree to control their production to a set regular amount. Producers have a quota which they try to meet without exceeding. In exchange, the rest of us agree that those farmers should receive a price that mirrors the rising costs of production based on a continually updated survey of farms across the country. Incredibly fair. The third pillar is controlling the excess of products from countries who choose not to control production of these essential staple foods. For Canada, I think you'd agree that this is a pretty obvious weakness given our relative size when compared to the markets of these food products from just over our southern border. That scale difference is becoming even more apparent in the last decade. Two new dairies in North Dakota would quadruple the number of dairy cows in that state. The smaller one with 12,500 milking cows, yes, 12,500 milking cows in one herd, would consume more than 500,000 gallons of water a day from the local aquifer, according to the North Dakota Department of Water Resources. Their secondary that they're building is exactly twice that size. Riverview, the company based in Minnesota, is getting around nutrient management regulations by planning to spread the manure from these two North Dakota facilities over the border in Minnesota. This mega dairy thing is a new trend, and in the last 25 years has driven massive concentration in U.S. dairy, with more than 50% of the milk consumed in the U.S. now coming from herds of over 2,500 milking cows. But from the outside, this scale has always been a problem. From over the border, we see massive production volumes with unregulated growth, massive overproduction, market crashes, desperate dumping, subsidies. We see it all. The danger has always been letting this spill over the border and put our dairy farmers at risk through the incontinence of the U.S. dairy market. This is not only entirely understandable, protecting dairy markets in this way used to be the norm. Even in the US and many EU countries had production controls, large tariffs on dairy imports to protect their farm producers of these perishable food and essential supplies. That's no longer the case. And what used to be a normal means of providing much needed protection for essential farms becomes an impediment to trade. When the dealer in chief and his gang of trade thugs spins these absurd stories, few on trade negotiation teams challenge their take, even though the facts are plain. First, if we look at the direct trade imbalance in dairy alone, since 2000, it's favored the US and has become massive since the USMCA was implemented. By 2024, U.S. dairy exports reached an estimated 877 million into Canada. That's a 67% increase since 2021 alone. And that's not isolated. With every free trade deal that we sign here in Canada with the Kool-Aid drinking regimes, Canada sacrifices more and more access to our dairy and egg and chicken and turkey markets, sacrificing that control that's supposed to be one of the essential pillars of this system that's meant to protect and maintain our food sovereignty and our food security by defending stable, fair markets in essential perishable food products. rather than chasing increased export growth to keep up the globalized Ponzi scheme. So I'm advocating that we need to think of supply management with two added pillars in order to make it food sovereign. Because clearly those three are not enough. This system requires political support. So in Canada, last June, our parliament passed Bill C-202, which said specifically that the minister, that is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, could not make international treaties or commitments that increase the amount of dairy products, poultry, or eggs allowed into the country without tariffs, or decrease the amount of tariff that applied to imports above that quota. So it's a very specific, very specific piece of legislation that limits the ability of the foreign minister to make specific changes to the things that are most likely to be changed in the USMCA deal. But political support goes beyond this. We need to provide ammunition, research, discourse that might be used against the free trade opinionistas, and they're actually far worse here in Canada against Canadian supply management than we see coming across the border from the American trade team. There are many think tanks and media outlets under the control of these folks here. I love this article that I'm showing you here by Al Muscle, who has worked at some of those think tanks, but said enough is enough when he heard some of the things that were being said specifically about these targeted items in the USMCA. The first point he makes is that the US and Canadian systems, particularly the trade protections for dairy, are remarkably similar. Both use tariffs and TRQs as tariff rate quotas. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds here, but by all means, if you're interested in the TRQs, ask me in the Q&A. But he points out that the main differences between the two systems, while the US has open dairy subsidies, they also have exceptional subsidies, they have sneaky subsidies, and while Canada has no subsidies. Canada has a system that's regulated to ensure stable cost of production pricing for farmers, while the US relies on dairy wholesale markets for price. That in turn then requires that government provide stabilization program supports, such as the Dairy Margin Coverage Program. So it's set into their system that they're going to have several points of support, subsidy, stabilization, whereas the supply management relies on none of those. They just rely on the basic pillars. And the last point he makes is that Canada has chosen to largely maintain a defensive posture relative to U.S. criticisms of the Canadian dairy policy, but the U.S. is the subject of many of precisely the same protectionist criticisms that it makes of Canadian dairy policies. And in fact, calling out hypocrisy and outright lies is a big part of the political support that we've been expending here at the NFU required to defend supply management in this country. Over the past year, between the tariffs and then the looming USMCA talks, there's been a flood of rhetoric and pop psychobabble from the free trade brigades who have been flooding the zone in this country in our media when it comes to criticism of supply management and tying concessions on it to these upcoming trade negotiations. If you're interested in a more in-depth discussion, I'd recommend this debate, but I wanted to pull out one point specifically here. The last 30 years in the US have seen a dramatic loss of small and mid-sized farms and concentration of chickens, eggs, and dairy onto mega farms. Research shows that proportionately more dairy mega farms are injecting their cows with synthetic hormones and more consistently receive government subsidies. A catastrophic 2023 crash in milk prices led to a $1.3 billion indirect government payments to U.S. dairy farmers. So the free market boom bust subsidy model works just fine for mega farms in the U.S., which brings me to my last point. Supply management was founded by farmers 50 years ago after mobilizing to protest the obscene levels of control and gouging and arbitrary market interference that the largest players, the dairies and the transportation companies, exerted on the free market. This was a very tangible in the street mobilization that led to political mobilization and actual negotiations. It's that level of collective mobilization that's required to turn food sovereignty from an idea into reality and maintain it for 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil, for that really important framing and speaking to the supply management and fair pricing, or something akin to parity pricing in the United States that we used to have in the United States but have lost over the past decades. Really important perspective that you bring there. So thank you so much. For folks listening in, just a reminder that you can add questions for Phil in the chat that we will try to get to at the end of this webinar. So please use the chat function for that. We're going to move right along to our next panel speaker. So I'd like to introduce Montserrat Tellez, is the advocacy coordinator at Fundación Semillas de Vida and a member of the national campaign Sin Maíz No Hay País, or No Country, No Corn, No Country. She holds a degree in international relations from the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM, and is currently pursuing a master's degree in Latin American Studies at the same university. She has focused on the transformation of the global agri-food system, specifically through understanding the process of corporate seed privatization and advocating for seeds to remain in the hands of small farmers. She has collaborated with the Center for Global Change and Sustainability, served as a policy advisor to the Chamber of Deputies, and coordinated the Talipan Alternative Market. So, Montserrat, you have 10 minutes for your presentation, and I'll just raise my hand in the chat here when you're in your last minutes. Please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me and that you can see my slides. Jordan, will you let me know if you can't hear me or
Montserrat,
not?
we can hear you fine, but we're having trouble seeing your slides, so you may want to try to share them again.
Sure. One sec. There we go.
Todo bien.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel and share the perspective from Mexico, not just on the review process, but on the renegotiation of the treaty. Karen already alerted us to one of the key issues for defending biodiversity in this context, which is precisely the pressures from the United States to include the International Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants, also known as UPOV or UPOV. So as you can see on this slide, in chapter 20, they undermine the right to gather and share and exchange seeds. This including in the new version would affect our capacity to save seeds. So UPOV was approved in 1991, and consequently, we as civil society have been organizing to block the implementation of the UPOV conventions. So here I'm explaining the specifics of why it's so dangerous. It creates a sui generis form of patenting and intellectual property rights theme. And what we saw since the 1960s is a broadening of intellectual property regime over vegetable biodiversity and plant biodiversity. We have, of course, native variety plants in our countries that big agribiz and big corporations are eager to patent and privatize. So the 1968 convention has an exception consecrated in a clause which allows peasant families to save and exchange from their harvest. So this defends peasants' rights, but one of the limitations of this exception clause is that it says that it's for just family consumption. But the EPOV 91 version, which may be included in the new version of the treaty of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, threatens the free seed saving and exchange amongst campesina communities. But this seed saving is part of a cultural practice. It's crucial for peasant agriculture and for agricultural biodiversity. And so another difference between the EPOV from 1978 and the EPOV from 1991 is that intellectual property rights are being applied in UPOV 91, not just to the original variety, but to all of the derivatives as well. This means that the intellectual property rights are being applied much more broadly, and consequently, the restrictions are much more dangerous and limit peasant seed saving much more strictly. When a peasant saves seeds and shares them and exchanges them and mixes them, all of that activity so crucial for plant biodiversity would become illegal. So in international law, as well as national laws in Mexico, the right to save, use, exchange, farm, save seeds is consecrated as a fundamental right. So this danger of extending intellectual property rights more broadly to seed saving and changing sharing seed is very much linked to the intellectual property and patents of the major seed companies. And here on this chart, we're seeing the percentage of the global market that, for example, Bayer controls. And the seeds that these big corporations have patented, be they Bayer or Syngenta or Pioneer and DuPont, which are active in the Mexican market, have a much greater percentage of control of the market in Mexico than the percentage that they control in the global market. And so we're very alarmed that the inclusion of 1991 version of EPOV in the new version of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement would severely limit the rights of peasants in Mexico much more. And I also want to let you know that there have been persistent efforts to harmonize Mexico's national legislation with the 1991 version of EPOV. And so here in this slide, we see that in 2012 and 2019 and 2022, there has been these waves of efforts to force changes in the Mexican national legal framework to so-called harmonize it with EPOV 91. So just recently, Mexico has claimed that intellectual property regimes such as those contained in POVA 91 and used by not just big seed companies, but also pharmaceutical companies, will continue to be discussed and negotiated because there is a great push from multinational corporations and from foreign countries to change the legal framework that protects these crucial rights for peasants in favor of biotech. So since the dispute that we had with United States that concluded in 2024 about the importations of genetically modified corn from the United States in 2025, 25 million tons of GMO corn was imported to Mexico, and each year you'll see that it increases. And so we lost the dispute in the context of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. So even though Mexico was trying to stop the importation of genetically modified corn and the consumption of genetically modified corn by the Mexican population. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Montserrat, for this important overview and the centrality of seed sovereignty to a vision for food sovereignty in the North America region, and also giving a really clear indication in how trade agreements like the USMCA and the use of UPOV 91 in particular to undermine the rights of small-scale farmers and peasants to be able to save seed. So really appreciate this important overview. So just a reminder again to our listeners that you can add questions for Montserrat in the chat, which we will have some time at the end to try to address. In the meantime, we're going to move on to our third and final panelists. So I'd like to welcome Jill Stockton, who is the owner and manager of a sheep and cattle ranch in Montana and an expert in livestock production, livestock marketing, and economic development of pastoral areas, with considerable experience in the Horn of Africa and the Middle East. He pursued a dual career, managing and working the family ranch since 1975 and accomplishing numerous assignments in the Horn of Africa and Middle East for agencies and organizations such as USAID, FAO, the European Commission, Save the Children Federation, and the British Red Cross Society. So, Jills, thank you so much for being here. You've got 10 minutes. I'll just raise my hand when you've got about a minute left, so feel free to take it away. Jills, there you go.
All right. Thank you very much. What I'm going to cover here is a very abridged history of how the trade agreements have impacted the American cattle producers. Um, from the very beginning of the NAFTA, 1995, 94, the American cattle ranchers and feeders were one of the industries sacrificed by that agreement. Imported cattle, particularly those from Canada, were used by the packers as a hidden source of supply that was not being accounted for in the publicly reported cattle markets. Ultimately, however, Canadian, Mexican, South American, Australian cattle producers were also thrown under the free trade bus. And the winners, of course, are the titans of industrial ag, the global packing cartel, the merchants of grain, and the sellers of herbicides and GMO seeds. In the U.S. here, our traditional organizations like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and the Farm Bureau was not protected at all of in fact, they were in favor of the free trade and the global corporations. So we fought back by forming some new organizations such as the Ranchers Cattlemen Legal Action Fund, RCAF, if you've heard that, and the Organization for Competitive Markets, OCM. And in our analysis, because the imported cattle and beef was being used as a supply hidden from the public market, we determined that the remedy would be to enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act to require market transparency and actual public competition. And in this vein, the Western Organization of Resource Councils, WORC, proposed rulemaking that would mandate that the packers publicly bid for the fed cattle. But over the past 30 years, we've not been able to have captive supply reform enacted by Congress or by any of the administrations, although we've certainly tried our best. In 2002, we proposed country of origin labeling, cool. Up until then, U.S. food was not labeled as to corporations, as to the country of origin. Manufactured items had been since the 1930s. And of course, the principle here is that consumers should have the right to know the origin of their food purchases, and livestock producers have the right to a fair and transparent market. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association and the American Farm Bureau has fought the implementation of COOL, and they continue to lead that opposition, even though most of their members, if you talk to them, are in favor of COOL. So although it was passed in 2002, it was for beef, it was not implemented until 2013. However, the governments of Canada and Mexico sued under the NAFTA regulations, claiming that COOL was discriminatory to Canadian and Mexican producers. Subsequently, the WTO ruled in favor of Canada and Mexico, and in 2015, the Republican-led Congress exempted beef and pork from the labeling requirements. All other food items, including chicken, seafood, and lamb, continue to be labeled. The immediate effect was a 40% crash in the cattle market, which meant that every semi-load of calves leaving a Montana ranch in 2016 brought $60,000 less. And this depressed market continued for the next 6 years. As a result of these below cost of production prices for cattle, ranchers could not afford to expand their herds. So the U.S. cattle numbers continued to decline. It should be noted in all of this that the Canadian and Mexican cattle producers, in whose name the WTO ruling had been made, were also losing $60,000 on each semi-load of calves. In 2021, Western North America was hit by a severe drought, causing a massive sell-off of mother cows. The result is that today, in the United States, we have the smallest cattle herd in 65 years, and U.S. consumers are paying the highest price for beef ever. The other result is that just over the past 10 years, 150,000 cattle ranchers and independent feeders have gone out of business. The cattle feeding sector, feedlots, is now functionally vertically integrated, the same as our chickens and pigs. And the ranching sector is now being targeted for vertical integration. To be noted that ranchers is the last segment of American agriculture that has managed to stay independent of industrial ag, and as a result is the only segment of agriculture that continues to be environmentally sustainable. Unless this changes, foreign policy changes, this will only get worse. The remedies are still the same. Captive supply reform, as first proposed by WORC, the Western Organizations Council, and reinstatement of country of origin labeling for beef. There are bills being considered in the Farm Bill to restore COOL, but the House version, which just was released and voted on last week, does not include COOL. And although we're doing our best, we're not sure if we can get it in on the Senate version of the Farm Bill. Well, that's, a pretty abridged version of 32 years of trade and farm policy in the United States. And I welcome any questions that you might have and other further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jills, for that overview. I think that's a really rich history and a lot of information that you've consolidated into just a few minutes here, but speaks to both the challenges and opportunities that we have in this moment of not just the Farm Bill negotiations in the United States, but as well, but also this USMCA review process. So we are really well on schedule. Appreciate all the speakers sticking to time. Just want to remind everyone that you can use the chat or the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to drop questions to our three panelists. We're going to open up the conversation to some questions now, and I'm going to give a stack of questions to the three speakers. If there are other questions that come up as they're speaking, please drop them in the chat as soon as you can. Jill's, there is a question in the question answer function below that I will also put in the chat that I'm going to have from Jim Goodman, who I'm going to have you just, I'm just going to give you the question in the chat so you can think about it, and then I'm going to come to you in a second. I'll read it out in a second as well, but I just want to get it to you as early here so you can think about it for a minute. And then, Montse, we have a question that I'm going to send to you in the chat as well in Spanish so that you have a minute to reflect. But Karen, I think you had a question for Phil. Maybe we could start off this round.
Sure. I don't know that I would make sweeping claims, but by and large, obviously, your point about scale is definitely true. The average Canadian herd still has only 105 head of milking cattle, and the average in the US is significantly north of that. And as I mentioned in my discussion, half of the milk that folks drink in the US comes from herds of 2,500 or more. So the environmental impacts of herds of that size are significant, and it's happening all over the U.S. From drawing down water tables to trying to dispose of the waste from herds of that size. It definitely has significant impacts immediately around the farms. Also has impacts on the water that remains in the water table from contamination, from nitrates. So there are all kinds of impacts of these massive scale farms, and it's not just, as you know, dairy farms. It's also hog farms and chicken farms. The scales of those, I talk mainly about dairy in my discussion, but yeah, the scales of all of those in the U.S. are just crazy wild. But we're seeing them now, being copied around the world. In Vietnam, in China now, they're starting to build uh, at exactly the same scale. So it's just, yeah, a huge impact. And I guess the advantage of being able to keep your herds at a very small size is most dairy farmers are still feeding their animals from food that they grow on their own farm. It's very sort of scale appropriate. You're growing the feed for your animals, you're spreading their waste on your own land, right there to be directly impacted or not by whatever your farming practices are. It just keeps everything more family and community relevant and less likely, let's say, to become an ecological disaster.
Thank you so much for that, Phil. Any other follow-up there, Karen? Okay, awesome. We have a question here for Montserrat. Montserrat, I'm wondering if you can speak more about the policy objectives of the Sin Maíz No Hay País, or No Country, No Corn, No Country campaign, and how you see cross-border solidarity, particularly with the US and Canada, supporting that effort.
I would be delighted to talk more about our national campaign, which is called Without Corn, There Is No Country. And it is a very broad coalition of small producers and peasants and consumers. And we strive to defend native seeds of peasant communities. But it also includes artists and human rights activists who have since 2007 have come together to defend our corn and also to oppose the NAFTA and subsequent free trade agreement, the US-Canada agreement, which has had such an impact on basic grains, throwing open the Mexican market and the importation of corn. And so we have this national campaign as a result to defend corn because we all know that without corn, there is no country. There was a panel, the dispute mechanism. He forged really amazing tri-national solidarity and coordination. Karen and others were very instrumental in building and forging this international campaign and support. We gathered over 100,000 signatures from Mexico and other countries to oppose the position of the U.S. government to not respect the Mexican government's decision not to import GMO corn. And U.S. and Canadian organizations also submitted written comment in defense of the Mexican position from a broad spectrum of positions. And this really shows the crucial importance of solidarity and coordination and joint strategy of civil society from these three countries. I also delighted to inform you that the construction of this trinational solidarity helped us learn about the situation of farmers in Canada and the US and learn about what we have in common and how crucial it is to continue to coordinate and trace trinational strategy together.
Thank you so much for that insight, Montserrat, and the importance of us linking our movements and efforts across borders so that we fight for trade justice at a regional perspective. This is the fight for food sovereignty is certainly an internationalist work as well as being rooted in our community. So thank you for this. I will drop a link in the chat in just a second about NFFC's statement from a couple years ago opposing the U.S. government's opposition to Mexico's seed sovereignty policies of a few years ago, particularly on seeds. And welcome folks working with folks like Montserrat to build that cross-border solidarity. So I'm going to pivot here now to a question from Jim Goodman in the Q&A function for you, Jills. So the question or point that Jim makes is that it says, it seems that the recent negotiations of trade agreements from the U.S. perspective or the U.S. government perspective have been based on the idea that corporations must win and that the U.S. as a country must win. How can we expect any nation to negotiate trade with the US when our administration does not want fair trade? While I think these ideas have been ramped up in this administration, they have been present for decades. So certainly a historical perspective being asked there, but also yeah, insight into how trust and negotiation and dialogue can even be fostered in this political climate, and the role of corporate power in influencing, particularly the U.S. government.
Yeah. I I see no coherency in our trade negotiation policies whatsoever. And I guess that's across the board, but particularly for that of beef. The I mean, the president's solution to the higher uh, beef prices in the grocery stores was to import more beef from Argentina, whom we bailed out to the tune of $40 billion, when um, at the same time we were cutting access to health care in this country. Um, the sheep industry has had a proposal before our trade representative for putting tariffs on imported lamb. The American sheep industry has been in free fall, and now, even though demand for lamb has been up and growing, 75% of the lamb in the market is Australian or New Zealand. We got no traction from the Biden administration, and just not, nothing so far out of the Trump administration whatsoever. So I feel sorry for any countries that's negotiating with us, because I don't know how they can expect um, that there can be a coherent trade policy done with the United States under this administration.
Thank you, Jules. Appreciate those insights and yeah, definitely agree with you. I've dropped a couple links in the chat that I had sent earlier, but I just realized I only sent them to the host and the panelists. So now everyone can check in on some of the comments around that work NFFC and IATP put together around the USMC NCA review process that Karen mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, as well as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants that enshrines the human right to save seed that Monse mentioned during her presentation. But Phil, I see you've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on what Jill was saying, because I think, as someone from outside the US, one observation would be that I don't particularly think that governments anywhere are terribly interested in protecting necessarily the rights of their farmers and of their citizens as much as they are the rights of corporations. I think that's one thing the free trade agenda has brought us, is sort of a global effort on the part of all governments to make sure that they grease as much as they can the wheels of multinational prosperity by setting a trade regime that ensures that if anyone is protected, it's going to be international corporate trading firms, including being allowed to sue governments. So, yeah, I don't think it's ever really been about sort of enabling your own population or ensuring justice for your own population.
Jordan, can I make a comment?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. The United States has some very strong antitrust laws, and one of the strongest is the Packers and Stockyards Act. And everything that's been happening in the cattle markets is clearly illegal under the Packers and Stockyards Act. which stopped being enforced about 1980 when Ronald Reagan became president. If the governments of Canada and Mexico have any concern for the welfare of their cattle producers, they should insist that the United States government enforces the Packers and Stockyards Act.
Thank you so much for that, Jills. I'm going to drop a link in the chat here from the Campaign for Contract Agriculture Reform, which uh, the Western Organization of Resource Councils and NFFC have both been longtime members. It gives a lot of background and insight into the Packers and Stockyards Act and that linkage to antitrust policy as a crucial tool, in addition to things like mandatory country origin of labeling, together can take on some of the corporate power that is has power on both sides of all the borders in North America. So thank you for bringing in that Packers and Stockyards Act angle. We have no further questions unless we've got a late arriving question from the floor, which is very welcomed. I want to I'm going to hand it to Karen in just a second for maybe some wrap up closing comments, but I want to see if our panelists have anything, last points that they might want to raise today. Phil, I see your hand might be up.
I just wanted to acknowledge that Patty Naylor had a question earlier about cheap corn and soybean meal is going to lead to cheap chicken, pork, and farmed fish displacing beef in grocery carts. I think from our perspective on this side of the border, but I believe it's largely the same there. We have never seen beef prices so high, not just in the grocery stores, but at the sale barn. It has just been a crazy couple of years for beef prices, and I think from what I understand, it's the North American herd has shrunk so much that it's just not catching up. Um, and so I think it's the prices in the grocery stores that's going to chase people to chicken and pork as much as cheap corn and soybean meal. Um, yeah, I have never seen prices like this, and now it's trickling down in this country into sheep as well. Our sheep prices in this country are now up at the sort of commercial scale as high as I've ever seen them. So it is a bit of an interesting time to be someone who uh, doesn't market into the large scale industrial system, but rather markets directly to people, because now what we're starting to see is sort of a bit of a balance, a bit of parity being achieved. The prices in the grocery store are now no longer lower than the prices that you find at farmers markets, for example, for meat. And that is a pretty crazy place to be, really, compared to, say, a decade ago. So interesting times.
Thank you so much, Phil. I'm so glad that you caught that question from Patty. Apologies, Patty, for almost missing that. Montse, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Just to go into greater depth about this issue and also to flag on this the important issue of biotechnology. I want to say that in the chapter on agriculture, it addresses the promotion of technological innovations in agriculture and facilitating access to these products. So 2 years ago, what we saw, the response to the efforts to restrict the importation of GMO corn, saw that companies that do the genetic engineering were favored. and the U.S. is really supporting um, genetic engineering of and other uh, forms of biotechnological intervention in agriculture. So I really wanted to flag this mention of biotechnological innovation of agriculture as very dangerous. And with regard to what we're talking about, the power and agenda of the three governments, it seems that the government will accept the U.S. agenda to reduce the geopolitical tension between the two countries. And so that is affecting the whole issue of the tariffs, which really is a kind of terrorism that forces the Mexican government to accept other bilateral uh, issues, including the whole issue of seeds. So I really wanted to flag the issue of so-called biotechnological innovations in agriculture as very dangerous and possibly accepted in the end.
Yes, thank you so much, Montserrat. That is a really important point, and I think this point that biotechnology has an integral part in the overproduction of commodities that are then exported, and also having um, economic, social, and cultural implications, particularly in Mexico, but I would say also in the US and Canada as well. I think that point around technology and the corporate control of that technology also relates to the point that Phil made at the beginning around the use of synthetic hormones in the dairy industry, and certainly that undermining the livelihoods of small scale producers in all three countries. So thank you for looping that back in. So I want to again open the floor just to our panelists to see if there's any closing thoughts, closing wisdom for this wide-ranging conversation that I think I found very fascinating. It's not often that we have the opportunity to bring so many diverse perspectives from different geographies together, speaking really on a similar line of points around what the future of trade justice should look like. So I want to give the floor for closing thoughts. Phil, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on something that Monserrat was mentioning earlier and bring it into conversation with the point you were just making, Jordan, because actually RGBH, while it does have an impact in the US, it doesn't actually affect us here in Canada because we banned it. And when I say we, I mean it's Health Canada, which is the agency that was responsible for deciding whether or not to allow that drug to be used in this country. But really, it largely came up against public opinion. And that public opinion only happened because one of the workers at Health Canada, who was about to pass this drug, one of the workers was opposed to that idea and brought it public, and it became a real thing. And that groundswell of public opinion was really what turned us, I say us, loosely, against RGBH. I don't think there were a lot of farmers in this country that were clamoring for RGBH. I don't think, the bureaucrats were particularly enamored with the idea of RGBH, but they were going to let it pass through because it had been passed in the US. And so many things in this country are simply passed as long as they pass by the regulators in the US, um, that they were about to do that. So it was down to this sort of public opinion meeting with the idea of sovereignty, and I'm so thankful that that happened 25 years ago. And yeah, so we don't have our GBH in the herd in Canada at all. And I think that's sort of a bit of a lesson for us. But of course, one of the big problems that we have is that our regulators, at least in Canada, are more and more frequently deciding that there are more and more things that they don't really need to check anymore, or they're going to leave it up to, the corporate folks who come up with a new seed or a new GM product, to self-regulate or to declare whether it's somehow a novel product. It's just the insanity like that we have to try and fight back against. But increasingly, folks who are meant to be working to regulate our food products to, our benefit are in fact more and more working for the benefit of the corporations that they're meant to be regulating.
Yeah, thank you so much, Phil. And I think that directly speaks to I think it was the fourth pillar that you mentioned on your slide of what food sovereignty needs is having that mobilization of farmers to, and I think, but also you're speaking to in a point of not just mobilizing farmers, but also consumers and the broader public to understand how these regulatory agencies get captured by corporate interests. Particularly if there's pressure from the US government, and that we have to do this political education and movement building, not just amongst our three countries, but different constituencies across the region. So thank you for highlighting that. There is a long fight within NFFC's dairy membership against RGBH. We don't have time to go into that history today, but just to say that there's a common struggle in history around that work in our two countries. So thank you for uplifting that. Jill, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to make a plug here for the importance of public competitive markets for agricultural commodities. Uh, Virtually all the commodities now that are grown in the United States, I won't talk about Canada and Mexico, are no longer publicly marketed, right? The last system, the last segment is the cattle industry that still relies on a publicly traded market system, right? And I don't think people understand how large the cattle industry is. Over half of the land devoted to agriculture in America is devoted to raising cattle. All right. Either directly as rangeland and the segment of the land that's raising corn and soybeans that's go into feeding them. The cattle industry, unlike chicken and pork, is divided into two very different sectors, right? Um, the cow-calf sector is very different than the cattle feeding sector, right? And it's been the cow-calf sector that has been most devoted to using a public market system. And that is what has kept ranchers independent from direct vertical integration. The packers have made a very concerted effort in the way they purchase their fed cattle to eliminate the independent feeders. It used to be that what we call farmer feeders all over the Midwest who would raise their own corn to feed cattle that they would buy from us Western ranchers, right? Well, they're going out of business in droves, while the very huge feedlots are getting bigger. Uh, and this drive towards the vertical integration model, like in chicken and hogs, has basically now taken over the feedlot sector of cattle. And the move is to vertically integrate ranchers. Now, what is society going to lose when ranchers are vertically integrated? You know, the ranching system, the Western grass-based ranching system, is really the only environmentally sustainable model we have left in America. You know, granted, we've got organic farmers and different and they're working very hard and they're doing very, very well. But as of a major commodity sector, this is the last one. And and it's worth some consideration from people who are concerned about food sovereignty and food purity.
Thank you so much for that framing and insight into the market structure and the change that what is under threat through the increasing vertical integration, Jills. I think that's a really important point here, and obviously the trade conversation is intimately tied into that market structure. So we're coming to the end here of our time together. I want to see, Monserrat, if you have any closing points you'd like to raise before we close. Anything, Monse, you'd like to raise on today's webinar before we end? You're good. Oh, good.
Well, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. If you'd like to know more about the proposals that were tabled in the review process, please get in touch with Semillas de Vida, and Karen also can put you in touch with us. So we're happy to continue the discussion and the trinational collaboration.
Thank you so much, Monse. So glad that you were here. We'll do a final thank you here at the end. I see that Patty has raised her hand. We're just asking folks to use the chat for questions or points they may have. We're not going to be taking floors directly from the floor in this webinar format. But Karen, before we wrap up, would you like to say a few words to conclude this conversation? Thank you so much, Karen. That's a great conclusion. I also want to echo that thanks to Jills, Phil, and Montserrat for their time and expertise and opening up a really important and big conversation. I also learned so much today. There was a question about the recording when it will go out. We will try to get that out in the coming days, together with some links from our speakers and their organizations for further information. Of course, always feel free to get connected to IATP or NFFC or any of our speakers' organizations for ongoing work on this topic. And as Karen and our speakers just mentioned, this is an important moment for building our collective power for a more justice-oriented future. So we hope that everyone here will work with us in pushing these alternatives and better vision. So with that, I think we'll close for today, and just one more applause and thank you to our speakers, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
All right. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.